All right, it is week 2 of our brand new series, Living Wisdom. This is where we are hoping to provide you hope after your dementia diagnosis. I'm Karsten alongside Deb Carriveau, and we are talking about this idea of, is my loved one's life over after this dementia diagnosis? And the answer is a big, loud
no.
And that people at home are probably like, yeah, right. It feels like that.
Right.
And that's a normal feeling though,
Very
right?
Very normal. And part of the reason is that because people who are living with dementia and walking that journey begin to have really significant changes in the way they think about things, the way they relate to their world, to other people. And so for the caregiver and family members, it feels very much like I'm losing my loved one.
And not to mention, as we've talked, there's just not an abundance of resources out there for people to understand the disease their loved one is going to be dealing with, how you can handle that. I mean, that's overwhelming. We all have our own lives, right? And then if something like this happens, that can feel almost like this avalanche, and that is normal too as well. Change is certainly not easy.
That's very true. And unfortunately, the risk of individuals who are at the highest risk to develop some form of dementia are those folks who are like beyond the age of 65. And for many individuals, that's the time in their life when they're planning retirement.
Right.
They're gonna, start to travel. They're gonna do a lot of things that they've always dreamed about. And along comes this, horrendous thing people call dementia and just blows all of that up.
Let's talk about changes, because the whole point of this series is to meet you where you're at. So maybe you're at the very beginning of this journey, maybe you're towards the end of it, but let's talk about the changes that you can expect to see in your loved one if they've been diagnosed.
Okay, so in general, all people living with dementia will go through a series of changes. What's different is, as the progression of the disease happens, is what the severity of those changes look like. So early in the disease process, people are going to be in denial about their deficits. They very often are going to think it's everybody else and not me that has the issue. Lots of times people are very protective of their dignity. They are not able to recognize that they need assistance or help. And so lots of times they can be argumentative, they can push back, they can say, I don't need you, I can do this myself kind of thing. And it's really just that struggle for them early on to start to recognize and understand what is happening and what those changes are. It also is a huge dignity issue for people to admit that they no longer can be fully independent. So a big part of it for the caregiver is to allow people to continue to do as much as they can for themselves and not try to rescue or do too much too soon. Typically, as people move into the middle part of the process, that's typically when people start to have more kinds of behavioral things going on, try to do things that compensate for losses that will put them at risk. Things in general that change with people with dementia is their judgment and reasoning changes. They don't necessarily recognize or understand the ways they put themselves or other people at risk. Oftentimes they will frequently struggle with language and understanding or comprehending what words mean or being able to follow conversations. One of the things we see early on is that people in the very beginning process oftentimes start to pull away from social connections because they start to recognize they're different, or I no longer know how to play the card game by the rules, or I can't follow social conversations, and they start to feel different. So rather than saying openly to someone, I can't do that, or I don't understand that, to protect their dignity, they'll just start disconnecting from people.
That is so hard. And by the way, that's our first 5 minutes. So that really kind of explains what you're going to experience. I do want to dive into this a little bit more because as frustrating as that can be for the individual who's going through this, that's got to be so hard for the caregiver.
Yeah, very much so.
Especially in the early stages,
very
right?
much so. And the problem with that whole scenario that happens early on is that when that loved one with dementia starts to pull away or disconnect, that spouse starts to go with that person. And so they also lose their social network and their support system. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important as people start this journey that they build new social networks, new ways of obtaining support. This is such a difficult time for individuals. It's critical that they have people that they are surrounded by who get it, who understand it, and who are going to be there for them. And it's just as important for that caregiver to understand it is not humanly possible to do this entire journey by yourself.
I guess that does lead me to the question of, if you're at that point where your loved one is pulling away because they're feeling a little bit uncomfortable in these social settings, do you keep trying to have them come out? Do you keep trying to continue that socialization? Or do you say, okay, you're uncomfortable with this, let's take you somewhere where it's more comfortable?
Yeah. So one of the things that's really important for caregivers is to try to start to plan in advance changes that you know are coming. Okay. So how do you prepare yourself? How do you prepare your social circle for what's coming? And a lot of that is just talking about it, being open about it. There tends to be a lot of shame connected to this diagnosis, and caregivers in particular who are trying to protect their loved one from people knowing. But that's the worst thing that you can do, because the more people understand the disease, the more people are openly talking about it, the better able people are to adapt and adjust to the changes that are coming for your loved one. So it really is trying to talk to your family members, talk to your social network of individuals who surround you and love you, and help them prepare. And one of the most important things that you can do in all of that is to prepare people so that your loved one and you are not being isolated.
Right.
One of the things that helps slow the progression of the disease and how rapidly people will progress is staying interactive, being engaged, being active in physical ways, in social ways, in cognitive things that help stimulate your brain. All of those pieces are critically important to maintain and continue to keep people at their highest level of function. And so when we start to withdraw and disconnect and pull away, we're actually creating a situation that allows that disease process to just progress that much more rapidly.
We talk about expectations, and I think that is just going to be a huge common theme with every single video that we do. And in my head, I'm just thinking, having that dialogue with your friends saying, okay, we can no longer do this card game, but we can do this. And it's like, instead of our normal game night being this, can we just change it to that? If that was happening with a friend of mine, it's of course, like, we want to help you, we want to love you. And I hate that there's this feeling of isolation and people just don't want to talk about it.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what this series is all about, is helping people be open and comfortable talking about it. And you're absolutely right. Most everyone who loves someone who is a part of their support system is going to want to do whatever they can to help. The problem is, frequently people want to help, but they don't know how to help. They don't know what to do, how to support someone. So a big part of this journey is talking openly about things and allowing us and other resources to help you know how to adapt and change. What you just said about the card game is a perfect example. So maybe one of the things that we love to do as a couple is get together with our friends, and I guess I'm thinking about the card game Uno. Okay, so maybe my loved one doesn't understand the rules anymore, that what number to play on. I have a yellow 2 and I can play that on a blue 2.
Right.
So maybe I throw a blue 4 instead of a 2.
Right.
So instead of everybody, being,
it's like, all right, we're playing off that.
Right.
Good, because that's the color I had anyway.
Like, let's all just be flexible with the rules.
Exactly.
And that's the other thing, the other way you can help and support your loved one on this journey is to embrace that what they're experiencing is normal.
Yeah.
You know, a big part of what our whole program at Living Wisdom Center is designed to do is to create an environment that normalizes living for people with dementia. That's one of the most therapeutic things people can do, whether it's in a home or in another setting. It's embrace that person as normal, create as many things around that person that helps them feel like they're everybody else.
Yeah.
But again, going back to that whole scenario of they live on the moon, we live on the earth, we have to make the adaptations.
Absolutely.
They can't change who they are or how they are because of their disease process. So in that whole scenario, we're the only thing that can change.
You know, you talked about the changes that happen when you're going through this disease, and that, again, is so difficult on the caregiver, right? Because they're constantly having to maneuver and figure out where their loved one's at as this disease continues to progress. When do you get to a point where you need help? Because let's be honest, help is expensive. Sometimes it's just not easy or doable. Or, you know, in my family, I want to take care of my family members as long as possible, right? When is that just not working anymore?
So typically, the most common time that in this journey people will reach out and say, you know, I can't do this anymore, is because there will come a time on this journey when your loved one's safety and well-being starts to be in jeopardy.
Yeah.
So people will wander away from home. People will, as we had talked about in our first episode when we were talking about what changes, people lose the ability to understand and rationalize, if I do this, this is what the risk is going to be. They no longer understand that. So they will put themselves in very precarious, unsafe situations. The other time that people typically start to reach out for assistance is when their loved one gets to the point where physically they need some hands-on care assistance, showering, dressing, feeding, toileting. Those burdens of physical health care can be very overwhelming for a caregiver. So typically that's when people will start looking for help and assistance.
Do you feel like, or do you see feelings of guilt when this happens?
Oh, absolutely. You know, as a loved one, whether it's as a spouse or an adult child, you know, I have gone through this with my father who had dementia. And one of the things that you start to feel is that if you get to the point where you go, man, I am just so tired and I'm so burned out and I just, you know, can't do this anymore, and you don't seek help, what starts to happen for the caregivers, you start to build resentment toward your loved one because, you know, everything is about that person now and your life has ceased to exist in many ways. And you're just becoming more and more exhausted, more and more overwhelmed by the need of your loved one. And so frequently it's that sense of, if I can't do it on my own, then somehow I'm a failure as a daughter.
100%. Yep.
Somehow I'm a failure as a wife or a husband. And that is so not true. And I tell people, you know, we here live every single day giving people with, you know, dementia what they need on a day-to-day basis. And it takes 30 of us around the clock to do what one or two of these folks are trying to do at home.
Yep.
It's just not humanly possible. Now, can you keep your loved one at home? Absolutely. But you got to have the resources, the help, the assistance, which we'll talk about in another episode, about what's available to you to be able to do that and keep your loved one at home.
It's so important. And actually that kind of circles to thriving versus just existing, right? So when you don't maybe have the care that your loved one needs, it all kind of circles back to, if they're not being stimulated, this disease is just going to kind of pounce. So talk a little bit about knowing you could be doing everything and think you're on the right track, but are there signs that show you that your loved one really is just existing versus thriving or getting the help they need?
Yeah. So the nature of the disease of dementia creates some very specific deficits by the way it's destroying brain cells and the way that clinically it occurs. And one of the ways we know we can slow that disease and progression down is by giving people appropriate stimulation, if you will, in multiple different areas. And so one of the things that we really want to try to help people do is to understand what they can do within whatever the living environment is that this person's in to create those therapeutic engagements. And when we do that, we see people thrive versus just exist. Existing is, I'm clean, I'm fed, I'm dry, but I'm sitting in front of the TV and that's what my life exists. Now, I'm not blaming or saying that's bad care at all. All I'm saying is just by the nature of the disease process, what people with dementia need is so far beyond just that physical maintenance care. And so we really want to get people to the point where they're active, they're engaged. That's when you start to see disease progression slow down. You start to see people do what I call firing on all thrusters. So even though they have dementia, every piece of the brain processing that's available based on where they're at in their disease process is all actively working to the best of its ability. And that's when you really start to see quality of life go up for people.
Gotcha. So you gave the example of kind of being sedentary, clean though, fed.
Right.
So then if that's not the most ideal, what would an ideal day look like for someone with dementia?
So a lot of that would depend on your loved one's life story and what are the things that always had value and purpose and meaning in their life. So anytime you're providing engagement or therapeutic activity, if you will, for someone with dementia, it needs to be in ways that are important and valuable to that individual, not necessarily what I might like.
Okay.
And so, for example, if my dad was a farmer for 40 some years, so one of the things that always had value and purpose to him was working in the dirt and being able to, take his graph paper and plot out his rotation of his fields and what crops were going where. So we would give the ability for those things to happen because those were the things that had, meaning for him. If I asked my dad to play banana bingo, he'd, tell me what to do with the banana and it would not be nice. Okay. Because it really had no value or purpose for him.
Totally.
So you really want to look at what is your loved one's background. Do they like gardening? Did they love being with kids? Was church and spirituality important? So you're trying to find those things that always had value and purpose and meaning. Now the challenge becomes when someone is walking with dementia, they can't do those things in the same way they used to. I couldn't put my dad on a tractor and let him go into the field because it wouldn't be safe at that point in time. So you're trying to always think about how can I make this happen? And what I tell people all the time is we have a tendency to want to do this all or nothing kind of thinking when it comes to people with dementia. So either they can do it like they've always done or they can't do it at all. And that's not the truth. The truth is finding that medium ground. So I tell people instead of saying, no, they can't do this anymore because they have dementia, let's say, what piece of this can we still let them do? What piece of this are they still safe and capable to do?
This is tough. This is hard.
Very.
There's just so many moving elements. It constantly changes.
Right.
But you guys also have so many resources. Like, I just love the idea that you guys have meetings too. And I think that's really important for people to know that, again, this idea of you're not alone, no matter what kind of phase you're in, there is help out there. I know we're going to expand on resources more in another episode, but it just really is important for people to know they're not alone.
Yeah. And if people are interested, our support group here is open to anyone in the community, not just people who live on our campus. And it's always the third Tuesday of the month. And if people want more information about that, I'd love for them to just go to our Hubbard Hill website. They'll find all the information, reach out to one of us, and we'll help you find help.
So does a dementia diagnosis mean that your life is over? No.
No.
Not at all.
Not the process of living.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
God bless.